When my wife's ex started texting her inappropriately, I asked her to block him. Her single friends immediately called me controlling and convinced her to meet him secretly. When I discovered she'd been cheating for months, her friends screamed, "You drove her to this." I calmly recorded everything they said, but my response 3 days later destroyed all their lives completely. I'm Nathan, a 29-year-old software architect who works remotely for a major tech company based in Seattle. I've been married to Melody for 4 years, and we live in a beautiful craftsman house in Portland that I was able to buy thanks to my salary and the flexibility of remote work. Melody works as a yoga instructor at 3 different studios around the city, building a strong client base and genuinely loving what she does. Our relationship had always been built on trust and open communication. We met at a coffee shop where I was working on my laptop, and she was reading between her morning and afternoon classes. What attracted me to Melody wasn't just her beauty, but her groundedness and emotional intelligence. She seemed like someone who had her priorities straight and valued genuine connection over drama. For the first 3 years of our marriage, everything felt solid. We traveled together, supported each other's careers, and talked about starting a family soon. Melody's work schedule was flexible, and my remote position meant we spent more time together than most couples. I thought we had the kind of marriage other people envied. The problem started 8 months ago when Connor Mitchell, Melody's ex-boyfriend from college, moved back to Portland after a divorce. Connor had been out of the picture for nearly 6 years, living in Chicago and apparently building a successful career in commercial real estate. Melody mentioned his return casually, saying she'd heard through mutual friends that he was back in town and looking to reconnect with old friends. Initially, I didn't think much of it. People reconnect with old friends all the time, and I trusted Melody completely. But when Connor started texting her regularly, the nature of his messages became concerning. He wasn't just catching up on old times, he was sending late-night messages about how much he'd missed her, how he'd always wondered what might have been between them, and how his marriage had ended because his ex-wife could never compare to Melody. When Melody showed me some of these messages, I was uncomfortable but tried to be understanding. "He's probably just going through a rough time with his divorce," I said. "Maybe he needs some space to process everything before he can have appropriate friendships." But the messages escalated quickly. Connor started sending photos from college parties where he and Melody had been together, talking about specific intimate memories they'd shared, and directly telling her that seeing her social media posts made him realize he'd made the biggest mistake of his life by letting her go. The final straw came when he sent a message at 2 a.m. saying, "I can't stop thinking about you, Mel. I know you're married, but I have to tell you that I'm still in love with you. If there's any part of you that feels the same way, we owe it to ourselves to explore what we still have." I found Melody reading this message the next morning, and she looked genuinely uncomfortable. "This is getting weird," she admitted. "I think he's mistaking friendship for something else." That's when I made what I thought was a reasonable request. "Melody, I think you should block his number and social media accounts. This guy is clearly trying to break up our marriage, and continuing to engage with him is just encouraging his behavior." Melody agreed immediately. "You're absolutely right," she said. "This is inappropriate, and I don't want him thinking there's any possibility of something happening between us." She blocked Connor on everything right there in front of me, and I thought the situation was resolved. But I had seriously underestimated the influence of Melody's friend group. Amber Rodriguez and Katie Walsh were Melody's closest friends, both single women in their early 30s who had strong opinions about relationships despite their own romantic failures. Amber was a freelance graphic designer who'd been engaged twice but never married, claiming both men had tried to control her independence. Katie was Melody's sister-in-law through her brother, a real estate agent who'd been divorced for 3 years and frequently talked about how marriage was a trap designed to limit women's options. When Melody told them about blocking Connor, their reaction was immediate and intense. They spent an entire evening at our house explaining to Melody why my request had been controlling and manipulative behavior. I was working in my home office but could hear every word of their conversation. "Nathan is isolating you from other men because he's insecure," Amber said. "Healthy relationships are built on trust, not on forbidding your partner from having friendships with people they used to date." Katie was even more direct. "This is exactly how emotional abuse starts. First, they make you cut contact with ex-boyfriends. Then it's male friends. Eventually, you're not allowed to talk to any men at all. You need to unblock Connor immediately and show Nathan that you won't be controlled." I wanted to interrupt and explain that Connor wasn't trying to be friends, he was explicitly trying to restart a romantic relationship. But Melody had asked me to let her handle her friends, and I respected her autonomy to manage those relationships. Over the next few weeks, Amber and Katie kept pushing. They convinced Melody that my discomfort with Connor's messages was a red flag, that I was showing signs of possessive behavior that would only get worse over time. They shared stories about friends whose husbands had started with reasonable requests and gradually became more controlling. "Look at Sarah's marriage," Katie would say, referring to a mutual friend whose husband actually was controlling. "It started with him asking her to stop talking to her ex-boyfriend. Now she has to ask permission to go to lunch with her sister." The false equivalency was maddening, but I tried to stay out of it. I trusted Melody to see through their manipulation and make good decisions about our marriage. I was wrong. 3 months after blocking Connor, Melody quietly unblocked him on social media. She didn't tell me about it directly, but I noticed her phone usage had changed. She was texting more frequently, especially in the evenings, and she'd started taking her phone with her to the bathroom and keeping it face down during dinner. When I asked about it casually, Melody said her friends had convinced her that cutting off Connor completely was an overreaction. "We're just checking in occasionally as friends," she said. "Nothing inappropriate, just normal catching up conversations." But her behavior kept changing in subtle ways. She started working late more often, claiming new clients needed evening sessions. She began going out with Amber and Katie twice a week instead of our usual once-a-week date nights. Most tellingly, she stopped sharing details about her day and became defensive when I asked simple questions about her schedule. The discovery happened completely by accident. Melody had left her laptop open while she went to shower, and a message notification popped up from Connor. The preview showed enough to make my heart sink. "Last night was incredible. I can't believe we waited so long too." I knew I shouldn't read her private messages, but the partial preview made it clear that something physical had happened between them. When I opened the conversation, I found 6 weeks' worth of messages documenting a full emotional and physical affair. The messages revealed that Melody had been meeting Connor for coffee as friends for 3 weeks before anything physical happened. But Connor had been gradually escalating the intimacy of their conversations, reminiscing about their college relationship and telling her how much more attractive she'd become since then. The emotional affair had turned physical 3 weeks ago at Connor's apartment. According to their messages, Melody had gone there to talk through their feelings and ended up sleeping with him. Since then, they'd been meeting twice a week at his place while I thought she was working late or out with her friends. But the most devastating part wasn't the affair itself. It was reading how Melody talked about me and our marriage. She described me as sweet but boring, complained that I was too content with our quiet life, and said she'd forgotten what it felt like to be with someone who was exciting and unpredictable like Connor. In one particularly painful exchange, Connor had asked her why she'd married me in the first place. Her response: "Nathan felt safe after all the drama with you in college. But I think I confused stability with compatibility. I love him, but I'm not in love with him anymore." I screenshot everything and saved it to a secure drive. Then I sat in my office for 3 hours, trying to process the betrayal and decide how to handle it. When Melody came home from what she'd claimed was a late yoga session, I was waiting in the living room with printed copies of her messages. Her face went white when she saw them. "Nathan, I can explain," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Before you say anything, I want you to know that I'm not angry. I'm disappointed and hurt, but I'm not angry. I just want to understand how we got here." What followed was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it was devastating. Melody admitted that she'd never really gotten over Connor, that marrying me had been the safe choice rather than the passionate one. She said Amber and Katie had helped her realize that she'd been settling for security instead of following her heart. "They made me see that you asking me to block Connor was about your insecurity, not about protecting our marriage," she said. "They helped me understand that I deserved to explore my feelings instead of just doing what you wanted me to do." That's when I asked the question that changed everything. "Melody, did you want to block Connor when I first asked you to, or did you only do it because I requested it?" She hesitated before answering honestly. "I wanted to block him. His messages were making me uncomfortable, and I knew they were inappropriate. But after talking to Amber and Katie, I realized that my discomfort was just internalized ideas about what wives are supposed to do." "So you went against your own instincts because your friends convinced you that your instincts were wrong?" When you put it like that, it sounds bad. But they helped me realize that I was allowed to have friendships with men, even men I used to date. "Melody, Connor wasn't trying to be your friend. He told you explicitly that he was still in love with you and wanted to explore a romantic relationship. How is that friendship?" She couldn't answer that question, and her silence told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly her friends had manipulated her thinking. The confrontation with Amber and Katie happened 2 days later. They came to the house for what Melody had told them was a support session to help her figure out how to handle my discovery of the affair. They had no idea that I'd asked Melody to invite them over so I could hear their perspective directly. When they arrived, I was sitting in the living room with my laptop open, the evidence of Melody's affair clearly visible on the screen. Their reaction was immediate and telling. "Nathan, how dare you violate Melody's privacy by reading her personal messages," Amber said before even asking what I'd discovered. "This is exactly the controlling behavior we warned you about," Katie added, looking at Melody. "He's trying to isolate you and make you feel guilty for having relationships outside your marriage." I let them talk for several minutes, listening to them explain how my reaction to discovering the affair was more problematic than the affair itself. According to them, I had driven Melody to cheat by being possessive and unrealistic about her ability to maintain friendships with other men. "You never should have made her cut contact with Connor in the first place," Katie said. "If you'd trusted your wife and let her handle the situation maturely, none of this would have happened." Amber was even more direct. "Real men don't try to isolate their wives from other men. The fact that you felt threatened by Connor says more about your insecurities than it does about Melody's loyalty." That's when I pulled out my phone and stopped the recording app I'd been running. "Thank you both for clarifying your positions," I said calmly. "I wanted to make sure I understood your perspective before I responded." The look of confusion on their faces was satisfying. They had no idea that I'd been documenting their attempts to justify and encourage Melody's infidelity. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. I'm filing for divorce based on Melody's adultery, which is grounds for an at-fault divorce in Oregon. I have documented evidence of her affair, including messages where she explicitly states that you two encouraged her to reconnect with Connor against her own better judgment. Amber started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. I've also documented your role in encouraging and justifying her infidelity. Amber, your graphic design contract with Mountain View Wellness Studio expires next month. They might be interested to know that you actively encouraged one of their yoga instructors to have an extramarital affair. Amber's face went pale. Mountain View was her biggest client, accounting for nearly 40% of her income. And Katie, since you're Melody's sister-in-law, I'm sure your brother Jason will be interested to hear how you convinced his sister to cheat on her husband. I'm also sure your real estate firm will be fascinated by your views on marriage and fidelity, especially since you market yourself as a family-oriented agent who understands the importance of home and stability. Both women tried to backtrack immediately, claiming they'd never encouraged Melody to cheat and that I was misrepresenting their conversations. But I had everything recorded, and their panicked responses only made them look more guilty. The consequences began unfolding within 48 hours. I sent the recording of our conversation to Jason, Melody's brother, along with screenshots of the messages showing how his wife had encouraged his sister's affair. Jason was furious, not just about Katie's role in destroying his sister's marriage, but about her willingness to manipulate and deceive someone in his family. I married Katie because I thought she was loyal and trustworthy, he told me when he called. Finding out that she's been encouraging infidelity and then lying about it makes me question everything about her character. I also forwarded the evidence to Mountain View Wellness Studios owner, Rebecca Chen, who had hired Amber to design their marketing materials and website. Rebecca was horrified to learn that someone representing her business had been actively encouraging destructive behavior among her staff. We built this studio around the idea of health, balance, and positive relationships, Rebecca told me. Having someone in our marketing who encourages dishonesty and infidelity goes against everything we stand for. Amber's contract was terminated immediately, and Rebecca made it clear that she would not be providing references for future work. But the most devastating consequences were social. Word spread quickly through Portland's yoga community about what had happened. Melody had been well regarded as an instructor, known for her talks about mindfulness, authenticity, and living with integrity. The revelation that she'd been having an affair while preaching about emotional balance and honest communication destroyed her reputation overnight. 2 of the 3 studios where Melody taught terminated her contracts within a week. The 3rd studio, where she'd been working the longest, put her on probationary status and removed her from their featured instructor list. Students started requesting different teachers, and her private client bookings dropped by 80%. Katie faced her own professional consequences when word spread through the real estate community about her role in encouraging infidelity. Several clients canceled their contracts, citing concerns about her judgment and trustworthiness. Her supervising broker called her in for a disciplinary meeting about how her personal conduct was affecting the firm's reputation. The personal consequences were equally severe. Jason moved out of the house he shared with Katie and filed for separation, stating that he couldn't trust someone who had actively worked to destroy another marriage. Katie's relationship with her brother became permanently strained, as Melody blamed her for destroying her marriage and Jason blamed her for manipulating his sister. Amber lost several other clients beyond Mountain View as word spread about her role in the affair. The wellness and yoga community in Portland is tight-knit, and business owners didn't want to associate with someone who had encouraged destructive behavior among their competitors' staff. Meanwhile, Connor's pursuit of Melody evaporated as soon as he learned about the divorce proceedings. According to mutual friends, he'd been telling people that Melody was planning to leave me for him, but when the affair became public knowledge, he distanced himself immediately. Connor was interested in Melody as a fantasy, not as a reality, one friend told me. The excitement was in stealing someone else's wife, not in actually building a life with her. Melody found herself facing the consequences of her choices without the support system that had encouraged her to make them. Her friends had convinced her to blow up her marriage for a man who disappeared as soon as things got complicated, and now those same friends were dealing with their own relationship crises. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. Oregon's at-fault divorce laws worked in my favor, especially with documented evidence of adultery and the recording of Amber and Katie encouraging and justifying the affair. I kept the house, most of our assets, and was awarded a favorable settlement that reflected Melody's role in destroying the marriage. 6 months later, I ran into Amber at a coffee shop. She was working on a laptop, apparently trying to rebuild her freelance business after losing most of her major clients. When she saw me, she looked genuinely remorseful. "Nathan, I want you to know that I never meant for things to go as far as they did," she said. "I thought I was helping Melody stand up for herself, but I realize now that I was encouraging her to make terrible decisions. I looked at this woman who had convinced my wife that my reasonable boundaries were controlling behavior, who had encouraged infidelity and then tried to justify it as empowerment. Amber," I said calmly, "you convinced Melody to ignore her own instincts and go against her own judgment because you thought you knew better than she did about her own marriage. That's not empowerment, that's manipulation." She tried to argue that her intentions had been good, that she genuinely believed I was being controlling. But I cut her off. "Your intentions don't matter when the result is encouraging someone to destroy their marriage and betray someone who loved them. You and Katie created a situation where Melody felt like she had to choose between her marriage and her friendships, and then you made sure she chose the option that would validate your own decisions to avoid commitment. The look of recognition on her face told me she understood exactly what I was saying. Single women who encourage married women to cheat aren't usually trying to help their friends, they're trying to validate their own choices to avoid the vulnerability that comes with committed relationships. It's been a year since the divorce was finalized, and I'm in a much better place than I ever imagined I could be. I've been dating someone wonderful for the past 6 months, a fellow software developer named Zoe who understands the importance of trust and communication in relationships. Zoe has never once made me feel like my boundaries are controlling or unreasonable. When I told her about Melody and the affair, her response was immediate. Of course you asked her to block someone who was trying to break up your marriage. That's not controlling, that's basic respect for your relationship. The difference between how Zoe talks about commitment and how Melody's friends talked about it has been eye-opening. Zoe sees relationships as partnerships where both people protect what they've built together, not as limitations on individual freedom that need to be constantly negotiated and challenged. I've learned something important about the difference between healthy independence and destructive influence in relationships. Good friends encourage you to communicate with your partner and work through problems together. Bad friends encourage you to hide things from your partner and make major decisions without considering the impact on your relationship. Melody's friends convinced her that protecting our marriage was a form of oppression, that maintaining appropriate boundaries with other men was a limitation on her autonomy. They framed infidelity as empowerment and betrayal as self-discovery. The truth is that Melody knew Connor's intentions weren't friendly, and she knew that maintaining contact with him was inappropriate. Her instincts were correct, but her friends convinced her that her instincts were wrong. They taught her to distrust her own judgment and prioritize their opinions over her own moral compass. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Amber and Katie had encouraged Melody to talk to me about her feelings instead of encouraging her to act on them secretly. What if they'd supported her marriage instead of undermining it? What if they'd helped her work through her confusion instead of encouraging her to embrace it? But those questions don't matter now. Melody made her choice to prioritize the opinions of friends who had never successfully maintained long-term relationships over the needs of a marriage that had been working well for both of us. The woman I'm with now has friends who celebrate our relationship and encourage her to communicate openly with me about any concerns or problems. That's what healthy friendship looks like in the context of committed relationships. And the friends who convinced my ex-wife to cheat? They're all facing the consequences of encouraging destructive behavior, learning that actions have results even when you're not the one directly responsible for them. Sometimes the people who claim to be helping you are actually using you to validate their own poor choices. Melody learned that lesson the hard way, but unfortunately, it was too late to save our marriage.